they were so adamant that they didn't want to try something just in case they got it wrong. And that's something that kids are just not aware of. They just make mistakes and just carry on going forward. And, if it doesn't work, what didn't work, how can we improve it?
Welcome to the LabVIEW Experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes. All right, so I am here today with Kabul Maharjan. Did I say that right? Is that close enough?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So I'm here with Kabul from Renishaw, which is over in the UK. I've known Kabul for several years now. We've met at NI Week and GDevCons. He's presented at a bunch of those and was recently at the one in Amsterdam, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to start just by asking you how you got started in LabVIEW and what did that look like?
Yeah, sure. So I did Robotics and Automated Systems at Plymouth University in UK. And part of that obviously was to do a placement year. And I was just looking for work and I were hiring. So I went in there as an intern. So before that, I was predominantly programming robots, PLC, ladder logic, that kind of stuff. And before that, it was Pascal, Basic, C, that kind of thing. And once I got into NI, got evangelized pretty much and started learning about LabVIEW. And I convinced my final year professor that I wanted to do my final year project in LabVIEW. He was absolutely against it. I did a little stereo vision kind of robot, almost like WALL-E, if you've seen that. So no sensors. The only thing was, take two cameras. This was the previous years to Xbox as stereo vision camera system. So it was pretty new. So learning about all of that and implementing that in LabVIEW was my first ever project as such. I even remember while I was at NI as an applications engineer, introducing myself as the vision expert while I was there. And I got pulled up on that very quickly by someone known as Mike Bailey, who was the vision expert. And it was a running joke. He keeps on mocking me to this day. I'm like, there's the vision expert. That's how I actually got started. That was 15 or so years ago, 2007, I think.
Yeah, that's about when I started. So yeah, it's interesting. Everybody kind of goes through that curve where you think you know what you're doing, and then pretty quickly at some point you realize, yeah, there's a lot more to know.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very cool. So you've been pretty active in getting young people involved in LabVIEW and the STEM stuff, right?
Absolutely. So in industry, I suppose, I run a graduate scheme at Renishaw. We've got a 7-year current cohort, and we've had an increase in that as well. But we start even before that. I work with local schools to try and get kids more involved in it. It's a shame that Lego and NI partnership kind of broke off a little while ago with the latest new Prime sets from Lego.
Okay.
But that was, before that, it was Mindstorms. And I used to even get our interns at Renishaw to, in the first week, play with Lego Mindstorms as part of their, probation tasks, so to speak. And I would take my kids into work and say, if you can entertain my kids and show them that what you've done in the first week of work with Lego Mindstorms, and if my kids say they're okay and they're entertained, then they can stay, and otherwise they're gonna not pass probation. So it was a nice, easy way of introducing interns into the scheme. But yes, so STEM-wise, working with schools, going into competition. This was the first year I actually took a team into a IAT, about it in America as well, I think, the Lego First League. Before that, it was just doing robotics club with the schools, getting them into programming kind of thing. But yeah, it was really exciting. I can't encourage people to do that enough. I think it was a great day, and I'm actually planning to do more in the following years and the following seasons as well. So
yeah, my kids are a little young for that, so I've not done anything with that yet, but I probably will when they get older. So.
Yeah.
I know Dave Thompson was really big into that, and there's a bunch of other people who are very big into that. Yeah, I had heard, and I had kind of, I don't know if they've officially taken a step back or whatever, but like it's not as popular to use LabVIEW now as it used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely a shame that, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's like, to me, that's like the killer application for LabVIEW, right? Because LabVIEW interacts with hardware. And so like, for me, like seeing, like typing in some code and seeing something in the real world change is just kind of the like magical thing versus like, creating a website or database or something. Like it's still there's kind of there, but it's not quite the same when you can't see it in the real world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of my kids, my second one of four, he is really getting into his programming at the moment. I saw him the other day actually learning about sort of SQL and things on something called Khan Academy, which is an online thing. I think it was backed by Mr. Gates, Bill Gates as well. So that's something cool if you have your kids, throughout the school years to have a reference to. So yeah.
So I'm kind of curious with the Lego first stuff. I've never really done anything with it. Obviously, they teach people a little bit, or they teach children, teenagers, about programming and about the technical side of it and building stuff. Do they teach them a lot about like working in a team and like team dynamics? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so that's something I focused really heavily. I started running these robotics clubs with something called Lego We Do for kids who were in year 3. So what's that? Around 7, 8 years old kids. So fairly young. So then all they're used to is in an hour and a half slot, so to speak, you're getting them to build together. You have one person looking at instructions for the Lego, the other person trying to build. So that's part of teamwork. And then they would go and take turns in programming it and testing it. And the task would be fairly straightforward. There's not big systems that they're building. You have to build it in half an hour, program it in under half an hour. So yeah, that's at that age, I think it's okay for 2 people as pairs to work together, but then show and tell and help others who haven't quite got there yet. So that's as much as it goes, I think, at that age. But as they grow older, the team gets bigger.
Well, I was kind of curious because I could imagine, so you mentioned like pairing, like there's this idea of like, right? Are you a single programmer, single hardware computer by yourself? Or are you working a team? Do you pair program or the ensemble programming? So, and I wonder if do kids naturally gravitate towards working in pairs and teams like that? Or is it like everybody goes off on their own and does their own thing and then they all come back together?
Every group is different. We encourage them to do it in pairs, simply because when one person's busy trying to do something, the other person's observing. And that's exactly what we do at work as well with pair programming, like you said. So yeah, they need a fair amount of encouragement especially when they're young, but once they get a hang of it, they're right on top of it. And I think that mentality of going in and knowing that you can just make mistakes and someone else is looking and learning from what you're doing is so valuable. And by seeing someone else just do something, you might learn about it as well, and then you can encourage them to do certain things as well. So very valuable.
I wonder how that translates. So like when you think of adults in pair programming, right? Like a lot of times some people are very resistant to it. And I wonder if it's that fear of making mistakes, or I wonder if it's like this ownership thing of like, if we create it as a group, I can't say I own it, right? But if I build it myself, then I can claim ownership and stake my flag in the ground. And
yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about ego in those kind of situations where it's personal kind of, I can't be wrong, or, that mentality kind of comes into play. And one of the teachers, actually, we got a few teachers to do the exact same thing as the kids were doing and see how they would perform. So we got 2 teachers to pair up and do the same thing. And they were so adamant that they didn't want to try something just in case they got it wrong. And that's something that kids are just not aware of. They just make mistakes and just carry on going forward. And, if it doesn't work, what didn't work, how can we improve it? And obviously, you always get some kids who just have enough and they just do something else. But yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, watching my kids just play and watching how they play and sharing and things like that. And although my kids are not in the sharing stage at the moment, but I have a 4-year-old does not like to share at all. He has to be forced. But I do think we go through that phase where they do change a little bit and they get that like community sense.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was at uni, I did something called cognitive robotics, which is almost teaching behavioral kind of thing to robots and seeing what the reactions would be. And just from the theory of that, I was quite intrigued about it. If I had my own little robot as a human being and what I could do to influence their behavior, it went from that to trying to, just see how, if I do things in front of them and if they take curiosity on it and they follow it on and things. And quite a lot of it is just that. It's just learning from behavior around. So when you start building a team and going, bringing that into work and kind of LabVIEW and practices and teaching teams that you're working with about principles, it all starts from you yourself first. How do you get others to, follow the practices that you're doing? And not everyone's going to agree. And like you said, there's a lot of things that come into play about, especially when you're talking about pair programming as well. There's reasons why people don't want to do it possibly would be quite high up there would be, oh, I don't want to be seen as someone who doesn't know how to do stuff.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too. And I think part of it is our incentive structure, because we reward individual behaviors instead of group behaviors, right? But what we really want is the group to be successful.
Yeah.
It's kind of a little misalignment there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm curious, what other lessons are there lessons that you've taken from working with the kids and the team dynamics there, and have you been able to apply them at Renishaw? Can you come up with an example?
Yeah, I try sometimes not to compare the team I have at work to my kids at home. Sometimes quite hard. But yeah, absolutely. The kids that, fail often, fail early. We've heard that mantra spoken many different ways in many different forms. And I try and show that as an example. Sometimes, if I've made a mistake, I'm owning up to it and saying, yeah, it's fine. Let's just see how we can correct it. But at the same time, the thing that I try and do at work, which is slightly different. Well, is it slightly different? I think it's maybe the same about the blame culture. I think we try really hard at work to not have a blame culture where you kind of, yes, it's okay to make mistakes. And if we know what mistakes are made, we can learn from them. But if we start blaming anyone about what's gone wrong, it ends up in a vicious circle and you just don't have in a happy place at all. It's amazing how that blame culture does exist in kids. Kids will say, oh yeah, you're wrong. But then the turnover point is so quick. You forget about it and you move on. Yes, you've been blamed, but you just carry on. And yeah, it's quite nice to be that almost innocence, I suppose, in many ways.
Yeah, the blame culture is really interesting because it generally does not get to the root of the problem. Like the example, I can't remember if I mentioned on the podcast before, I was talking to a guy, Rob England, and he told the story of a woman who was cleaning in this data center. She was a cleaner, and she accidentally bumped the plug and turned off the power to some part of the data center, right? And so immediately they fired her. But they didn't fix the problem because the plug is still there on the wall and anybody else could walk by and bump the plug, right? So why do you have a system that has that vulnerability, right? So the correct thing to do is to look at the system around it and say, where did the system fail as opposed to the individual? So,
yeah. Something related to that, I suppose, something that we've started doing more recently than before is we try and focus less on the processes, what people need to follow, but focus on the people themselves. How do we make people successful?
Yep.
And, the previous discussions that have been led by, I think, Ben Carruthers in second GDevCon, where we had a panel discussion about how to retain people. All of those things kind of feed into the, ideas that we then implement and, learn from the community. That's what we're doing with GDevCon, I suppose, leading nicely to a little set.
Yeah, I really like that idea of focusing not so much on the processes, but more on people. And also, like you mentioned, what it takes to be successful, how do you measure success, right? It's some places measure success, how well we followed the process. Well, that's not necessarily the best way to measure, right? You should be measuring the outcome for your client or customer. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose I could give a few examples of different measures of success. I suppose if you're a manufacturing company like Renishaw is, we try and automate manufacturing where possible, test as well as manufacturing. And things like first-time pass rates, yield, those kind of things come quite high up as a measure of success of the systems that we've built. At the same time, you've got the human aspect of it. How often are operators or people who use the systems having to get call-outs? That's another measure of success. Obviously, the marketing side, the sales side comes into play, how successful the product is. So you've got various different ways of measuring success. And as developers, and especially in the teams that I work with, some engineers are not at all excited about, we've had this much amount of sales. That doesn't mean anything to them. What they really care about is, oh, I've made these many people happy because they've not had to call out anymore, or they use the systems that I've created really well, and they go home happy. So you get a big mix of measure of success, don't you?
Yeah, well, I think you have to be very careful with metrics, right? Because if you focus on one too much, then you get tunnel vision. And it's more of like a holistic thing of like looking at the whole system and balancing all the various constraints.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and also too, like you said, there's like a human element that's sometimes hard to quantify. You can't really put a number on it, but it's still very important.
I think it was first heard, I think it was Fabiola that said about how she was a co-janitor. And it was interesting to hear her say that because, some developers do always have that feeling of, oh, I'm at a particular level and something is underneath me or beneath me or what have you. And you kind of focus on, okay, I'm now the architect. I'm not going to focus on the code level. Someone else is going to fix that bug, or it's just a small little thing. I find that I agree with Fabiola, in fact, where I think that if each of us focuses on the problem together, I think you get a lot more happy people. But if you start saying, oh, this is not a problem, this is not a problem, and try to shuffle it around, it just becomes a mess.
Yeah, it's kind of having like a holistic look at the problem and at the team and making sure that maximization, right? Like I got my part right, and my part works fine, but the whole system fails. Well, that's not exactly the outcome that we're looking for.
Yeah. I think, did you ever read that book? Was it Drive by Daniel Pink?
It's on my list, but I have not read it.
That was one of the books that was recommended to me while I was talking to people at NI, and it focuses on, how you form a good leadership campaign around the team that you build. And I think the three things that they focus on is make sure that people know what the purpose is, provide people with autonomy, and
mastery. Was that the other one?
That's the last one. That's right.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about the book. You haven't read it, stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of about like what motivates people. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
The one thing I always liked in that is a book called Freakonomics. They have a podcast. I think it's because it talks about things like that as far as like how. So the Daniel Pink book I think is more about like internal motivation, like what motivates people internally. But like Freakonomics is about like external motivation. So an example you might enjoy out of the book is they had a daycare somewhere that was charging like, I don't know, $200 a day or something. And people were picking up their kids late all the time. So their solution was, all right, we'll just start finding people who pick their kids up late, right? But they find them like $5, right? So the next day, everybody left their kids like, oh, I can leave my kid for an extra hour and a half for like $5. Like that's and so they got wrong. And I think, sometimes in business, we do that too, particularly in software, right? Like we reward, the big one I see where we get it wrong is we reward the firefighters. Actually, often also the arsonists, right? Somebody creates a huge mess and then they get rewarded for cleaning it up. or like, right, the janitor there mopping the floor and cleaning everything up and preventing it from getting to be a big mess. And the person who just kind of lets it go until like everything's on fire and then they have to go put it out. So
yeah,
there's definitely is like that part of the culture at a lot of places, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So you go into lots of companies to support them, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So when you see, and let's say there's a hypothetical company that's starting up and they've got a lot of investment, they're trying to set up a team of developers, and they're stuck between two approaches. Do they hire a whole bunch of awesome, CLA level developers and try and make them work together in some way, or do they start up, fresh, have one or two lead engineers who are quite, experienced in architecting code and have a whole bunch of new people that might have not have done too much? Which way would you go?
I am not a big fan of hiring superstar developers. So, I mean, I think that like oftentimes they cause more problems than they solve. But I do, it depends on your situation too, right? So if you have an existing project, I think you need slightly more experienced people. I think if you have a like greenfield project where you're starting from scratch, you can bring in people and they can grow with the project. I think that's a really useful way to do it. But yeah, you do need at least one or two like senior people to kind of guide people in the right direction, I think.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the training out there for NI, like the NI training is basically how do you do X in LabVIEW? And it's really good at that. It's really good at like how do I create a for loop? How do I create a while loop? But it doesn't really tell you why. And that's what's missing. And that's where I think the senior engineers can show you, they can show you all the constructs that you've learned in LabVIEW Core 1 and be like, use this one all the time because this is better than that one over there because this has these problems. And right. And like, you just don't get that from the class, I don't think.
No. Anecdotally, there's one thing that just circles around in our team fairly often whenever they're new started is a screenshot of different ways of creating functional global variables, a while loop, for loop, and whatever other imaginative ways you can think of creating this. It's like, there are options. Just which one do you encourage people to use? Well, that's just a simplistic example, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and also, why would you use or not use a global variable?
Yeah, absolutely.
There are certain use cases where it makes total sense, and there are lots of use cases where it's a really bad idea. Right. And it used to be like fad. We used to rail about like, because they used to like say, oh, globals are bad. They're, in some cases, they're not that bad. If you put them inside a library and it's like scoped and like, you can control access to it, generally there's better ways to do it. But if you don't know any better, you pick up this hammer and everything looks like a nail. So I think that's like the biggest problem in software engineering, I think in general, is we get distracted by shiny things. We find a shiny thing, and then it becomes our new hammer, and we just start pounding.
Yeah. I think worm, write once, read multiple kind of variables. All of those has its use case. Why wouldn't you not use it?
Yeah. It's about applying it appropriately. I think one of the things I read a blog post about this just the other day is like, when you get medicine, it comes with like counterindications that say, don't give this to somebody with heart problems or who's pregnant or blah, blah, blah. Right. And all software things, all techniques, queued message handler, when should you use this? When should you not? Active framework, when should you use it? When should you not? But we don't do that, right? No. We give these presentations, and I've yet to see somebody stand up at a presentation at a LabVIEW Summit and say, here's this cool technique, and here's when you shouldn't use it. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe I missed it. Maybe somebody has. And I'm as guilty as anybody else because I give them these presentations. I don't remember anybody ever even asking me, like, when would you not use this technique?
Yeah. So on the similar sort of thread with ChannelWire that's been around for a little while now, how many of your architectures or frameworks, or when you teach, do you go through that in detail? Because NI courses do.
I have never used them, but I think that's partially because I'm an old curmudgeon and I learned the old way. And also, I feel like it's like a control thing. I feel like I have more control. I don't know that that's true. I did see Derek Bomarito gave a very good presentation at the GDevCon over in Colorado, and he was doing some really cool stuff. So very, very cool. I just haven't bought into it yet. And I don't know. I'm kind of a late adopter. Like I didn't use the auto tool for the longest time, because I learned from somebody who liked the old way, and so he taught me how to hit tab like 50 million times every time. So it took me a long time, and like Quick Drop, it took me a long time to warm up to that, and now I use it all the time. So I don't know. I might not be the best barometer in that sense. Yeah, I still use VI Tester. So.
Oh wow. Oh. That's cool.
Actually, I want to. There's a guy, Anton Lundquist, is that his name, who created L Unit. He gave a presentation at the GLA Summit. He may have even given one at GDevCon. So I need to try that because it looks nice. I like the simplicity of Karaya. I don't like the fact that like it seems unorganized. Like you don't need a test case or anything. It's just like, where do I put all these tests? And I don't know.
Yeah. I think Karaya has kind of hit the right spot for me and my team. We just have a separate library, which is just tests. And we focus on you could argue some of it is integration tests, but it's, we're using Karaya for it. It's good.
Well, it's funny because I use Python sometimes just for like personal projects. And I use PyTest, which is basically the equivalent of Karaya in Python. And I have no problem with it in Python, but for whatever reason in LabVIEW, it just, I don't know. It's interesting, like the rate of change and adopting new technologies and stuff. And
yeah,
I definitely feel like I said, it's weird because I want to be this new innovative person. I want to try all these new things, but like I'm more of a skeptic, I think. Like I have to see a really good use case for something before I go adopt it.
But that's not a bad thing at all, is it? It's stability. You want to go into something that's stable, because if you keep on trying new things out as they come out, what you always end up in a cycle is just trying to keep up. And if it doesn't work, there are things that get written off and until it becomes stable. NXG was quite an example of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, to me, it's a lot of it's about like trying to figure out how to do an experiment, right? So like part of it is like being a consultant. In some ways, it's nice because I can, in my free time, I can do whatever I want. And I can choose to try new frameworks and stuff. But at the same time, like if I want to get paid, I have to find a project that allows me to use it. And so,
Sure.
And I was talking about this with Malcolm and some of the other people earlier today about how like it's this catch-22, because the best way to learn something new is to try it on a project, but you don't really know where that thing's strengths and weaknesses are until you actually go try it.
Yeah.
So you need to find a project where you can try it, but it's got to be the right size project. It's got to be big enough that you get like a good feel for if the thing works or not.
Mm-hmm.
If it's too big, then there's too much risk, and you risk like. So it's kind of that idea of like creating an experiment that like really tests the thing, but it's not fatal if you fail, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Binary Palette provides software development and consulting services for LabVIEW, Veristand, and test stand-based systems. It is run by Ravi Benawal, a certified LabVIEW architect and LabVIEW champion, with over 2 decades of experience in the NI ecosystem. Binary Palette is committed to crafting software and systems that increase user productivity and simplify workflows while making the experience enjoyable. Want a turnkey test system developed from the ground up, or existing systems upgraded? Looking to outsource your software development? Binary Palette is ready to help you drive your next project to success. So speaking of experiments, can you think of a time that you did an experiment and it didn't turn out the way you thought it would? And what did you learn from that experience?
Oh, there's one time when we were releasing a new product to market, and we had this test called functional test for these devices that we were sending out to customers. And yeah, for some reason, I had a disabled diagram structure in place where I just was in debug mode and just, passing units because I wanted to get it to the next phase. So if you imagine a test sequencer, one of the test sequence was just a override pass and not actually doing the test. So quite easily done when you're debugging and just trying to skip through. It just happened that it was a very high value customer. It was, we sent the product over to Amsterdam. We didn't actually know if it was a good or a bad product, found out. And yeah, it was quite an expensive thing in the end to go and replace it in the customer site and so on. But I think what was really valuable from that experience for me personally was going back to the blame culture side of things. I didn't hear a peep about, it was my fault or anything. I completely owned up to it. It's my fault. Let's correct it, get the code. And then from then on, that's when we started saying, okay, well, we kind of need some form of indication in our recording system, in our databases to say what tests have been passed, what tests haven't been passed, and which have been disabled as well. So yeah, an interesting way to expend a bit of money just by disabling a bit of code.
You see, but that's the power of not blaming people, though, because the problem actually got solved, right? Because if they just blamed you, they could have fired you or fined you or whatever, right? But then the problem still could have recurred. But because they didn't blame you and they looked at the system and said, well, what in the system allowed this to happen? Right? So you came up with a way to check to make sure that didn't happen again. And, maybe come up with some better like debugging or testing practices. Like we were talking about unit testing, you're like, if you've got like test flags in your software where like in the running code, there's a flag that says test or debug or whatever, and you could turn it on. You got to be very, very careful about those things. Like, you should probably try to figure out how to get rid of those, because if you accidentally leave one on, then
absolutely.
And the same way with like simulation mode and stuff, like a lot of the projects I do, I like create simulation classes and stuff. You really don't want to accidentally ship the simulation class and have it like, they think everything's going fine and the machine's going haywire and they don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, we manage some of our simulation classes in exactly that kind of manner where every result has got some form of a GUID or something that signifies, okay, well, this is of what the system instance was like when it ran the test. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. No, I could definitely see lots of problems being caused by those type of things. So you wanted to talk a little bit about my earlier conversation with the org about inner source.
Yeah, so that was quite interesting session that you had with you. I suppose it starts off from the thought that as part of my work with Renishaw, we don't really publish so much to the open source community, because Bjorg has got a lot of output. And interesting, that was not the first time, but it was quite a nice discussion revolved around inner source. And we use a lot of practices and a lot of, talk about DKMH, it's fairly open source, and some of Jörg's modules as well. I really like his logger module, and we use it internally. It's great to try and we don't need to rebuild everything from scratch. And we've got frameworks internally. We've got something called SLA, we've got something called FSP, a whole bunch of different variants of them, depending on which team is working on them. But it all takes inspiration from open source. So I just wanted to plug that and say, yeah, I know Jörg was talking from the outside point of view, as in, he goes into companies and delivers those kind of things. And I'm kind of wanted to pipe that up to say, yeah, it definitely happens. We are an example of the users of it, I suppose.
So you guys have like an internal GitHub or GitLab instance then?
Yeah, so we use Azure DevOps, and we've got sort of something called Renishaw toolchain, which people then contribute to. Most of our CI/CD stuff is also kind of team owned. So anyone can put in a pull request to update a feature if you like, or apply a bug fix and so on. We use SharePoint because it's all Microsoft based. So we use SharePoint to create pages. So it's like a wiki, if you like. So it's Renishaw wide publicly searchable, and then that links to where the repositories might be. So we've taken inspiration from LabVIEW Wiki, from a whole bunch of different areas to try and make it easy for developers to find information that goes back to starting up with LabVIEW as well. What you mentioned earlier about, once you get trained, how do you actually get started? Because training's not getting started, it's just getting shown how to do things, but you then need to learn about, what already exists, what can we already use, how do I learn about them? So any information that provides a bigger picture for that is something that we're actively trying to do more of now.
So you guys have a lot of LabVIEW developers. Do you have like an internal LabVIEW user group?
Indeed. So we've got in our licenses, but I see something around 150 people using it regularly. And in the Renishaw user groups, at the moment, run it around once every 2 months. And we get around 20 to 30 people in each of those. So it's a fair amount. It's quite interesting because what we're trying to do is open that community up from just being LabVIEW to being software in general, because the type of things that we do with LabVIEW, it can quite easily be done by C# or Python or PLC and ladder logic. It again depends on what the goal actually is. So we've tried to make sure that we don't just solve every problem with LabVIEW. We try and skill people up, different teams that do different types of projects, different types of IDEs, different types of tools. And we try and make sure that we're using the right tool for the job.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. I can see both pros and cons to opening it up, right? I guess if you have a LabVIEW specific, you can dive a little deeper, but yet at the same time, if you open it up, you broaden your horizons and you learn new techniques. And
so there are different levels. They're not the same user group. There's something we call Cahoots, which is the general software, which happens once every 3 months. And then every 2 months, we have the LabVIEW user group, which is specifically just for LabVIEW. The last one I think we did was about unit testing and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that sounds like the right way to do it. Like, every so often you all get together and share amongst each other, and then you have the focused ones that are just LabVIEW or C# or whatever language it happens to be. Yeah.
I had another question for you, actually. With the teams that you work with, do you have many teams, or actually, rephrase that, with scrums in Agile and development practices, do you see that used much with LabVIEW? What's your experience been like with that?
So a lot of the teams that I work with are really small, and a lot of them have like no process. Like I still run into teams where their source code controls a shared drive. Folders. So they're definitely not doing Scrum or Agile or any of that stuff. When I worked at Westinghouse, we did Scrum, or we called it Scrum. I don't know that we were like following all the official rules or anything. So I do see it being used. There's a lot of resistance to it. A lot of companies are still stuck in that waterfall mindset that they want the certainty of, you're going to deliver on this date for this price and, this set of features. And Yeah, a lot of my consulting stuff, like the actual doing the project work, a lot of it is trying to convince people that that's not a good idea. So that's, yeah.
Oh, cool.
Surprisingly, a lot of places more and more places are accepting of that. So it's not as hard to sell as it used to be. So I don't know if it's they're looking around and they're seeing other companies doing different things, or I don't know if they've just finally like been doing it the old way for so long that they finally felt all the pain, or
That's
I don't know. I assume you guys do some sort of agile Scrum type process.
Yeah, it really depends on project and what stage of its cycle is the project. Especially through the early phases, we try and deliver something, again, quoting Fab again, give something that they don't want. The sooner you give them something that they don't want, the sooner you find out what they do want.
Yep.
So yeah, we try and iterate very often, Leon, and as we gather more and more requirements, especially if we've got hardware in the equation, well, we do stuff called sprites, which is effectively, try and do little bits of code which you're going to throw away, just make sure that communication's done, that kind of stuff, and then grows into sprints, which is 2 or 4 weeks depending on what the project is. Once you get to a particular point in that time, it turns into a Kanban system, which is effectively prioritizing the top items and then just dealing with new things as they come along. But yeah, it again depends on developers as well. Some developers just don't like doing it because they're much rather just go in and it's a small enough project, you just want to go ahead and do it. Stakeholders are aware of what is being done in what manner. Yeah, so it very much depends. But we have actively taken the steps to make sure everyone's aware of the different practices instead of saying, oh, you should use these practices. As long as you're aware, as long as you know how to find it, and if you want to use a particular process for any other project that you're working on, here are a few consultants or leads, if you like, that you can go and talk to get more inspiration or training or what have you.
Yeah. Yeah, what I tend to do with customers is very similar to, it's kind of like a mix between Kanban and sprints. So I do like 2-week sprints, but like we meet every week and we kind of prioritize and we work off of a list and kind of combines the best of both worlds. Yeah, to me, like the big selling point for me is like risk, because, if you, like the old school model is you hire a developer, you hand him the requirements, and then he disappears for 6 months and he comes back and maybe he has something that works. And if he does, chances are it's not what you wanted anyway. Well, so, at least if you like break it up and you deliver something every couple of weeks, they have the ability to see what's going on and you can kind of track the progress and like it, like if you're going to run over, by like month 3, like, yeah, this is not going to finish in 6 months. It's going to be a bigger project. And so you can make that decision. And you're not committed to doing like the whole 6 months thing too. If you figure out in 2 months that it's not going to work, you can just throw your hands up and walk away. And yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how people want to like put themselves in that box and just be like, we're going to do this for 6 months no matter what, and then see what happens. And it's like,
yeah. I think some of those things can be really stressful. And I think going back to the kids' discussion, I mean, we've had 4 kids, and after the second one, the wife, the Mrs. Tammy, she came across something called hypnobirthing. And while she was going through that, I kind of just listened in and just, curious about what the whole thing was about. It's just a method of pain management that's used during labor and birth. And kind of thought, is this going to be useful for me? I have a lot of stress at work sometimes. Can I use it? And it involved a hell of a lot of visualizations, and it's effective meditation in some ways. It's a form of relaxation, and there's a whole bunch of breathing techniques and things. Started using some of that, and I thought that quite helped in just being stable internally, just being stable, calming yourself down, and which had a direct result pretty straight away. There were times when we would have a panic, if you like, oh, the server's gone down, we've got to do something about it, or a system's gone down, there's a product hold, anything of that nature. And it's nice to hear others in the team come to you and say, oh, we want you to be involved in this, because when we come to you, there's no panic, everything's calm, and we can put our ducks in order, find out what to do next, and tackle it in a sane manner, so to speak.
Yeah, panic usually only makes the problem worse.
Yeah, you do karate, right?
Yeah. I was going to say, my wife used to do this. You remind me of this. My wife used to do this yoga stuff, and I forget. It was a specific type of yoga, but where they read this like really slow, like meditation. They talk about like sit down and relax and close your eyes, and that I found really useful. But yeah, you mentioned karate. I used to do karate for a while, and they were very big on the breathing part of it, and just like doing like belly breathing, I guess you'd call it, and like taking deep breaths, and it's very calming and relaxing, and how it helps to focus. So I think that's really interesting. The other cool thing that I got out of karate was I say something about imagination becomes reality, which I thought was a very interesting thing. That like, before you could actually do something, you have to like imagine it in your mind and create it. And like, so if you can create something in your mind, then it kind of sounds like this Oriental mysticism stuff, but it actually does. There is definitely some truth in it. So.
That is very powerful. If you can see it, you can be it. I think Tom had that in his initial bit in the Amsterdam session that we ran.
Yeah, that was also part of what brought it up, because I just watched that in preparation for this. So, yeah, I think that's a great note to leave things on. So that was a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been good. It's been good to catch up, and be part of this is great.
Thank you. That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @TheLVExperiment.